So it's my privilege to tell you what all the incredibly talented people who stood up a moment ago have been doing for the last year and what we're scheming to send your way in the years to come. So I'm going to start by showing you the latest version, which should have been out before the conference, but just slipped. Hopefully, if I'm lucky, I'll be able to demonstrate some of the key features if this cable holds out. I'm going to talk about what's in the next release cycle. We're going to be brave and have a version 13.0 unless anybody here tells us that they absolutely could not install the release with that version number. We might need to rethink that. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about something which is really very experimental that I can't give you many details on yet, but we'd like to start spilling a few small beans and get some initial feedback. I'm going to try and be funny and pretend that I know just a little bit about cloud computing. And then I'm going to try and make a few recommendations about what I think what we think at Dyalog you should be looking at with your applications for the years to come. Now, version 12.1, I think we said at the last conference, this was going to be a year of consolidation. We had a new QA manager coming on board. He was going to take charge. He was going to make us build and install and QA on every platform every night. We're going to focus on finding and killing a few more bugs than usual in this release, speed things up a bit. But when I looked at the list of stuff we'd done, it was a bit surprising. A lot of stuff sneaked in. We had a significant scope creep. Making version 12.1 faster was in the original plan, and that's worked very well. We managed to make a first start on putting multi-core features into the product. The most visible and perhaps most important for many people enhancement is going to be the completely new editor that John Daintree has written. That really makes it much easier to work with large namespaces and classes, which a lot of people have started doing. We put in a fast XML to array conversion tool. We finally decided, we thought we knew what people were going to need on that. We've made it possible to use Microsoft.NET GUI components directly in the Dyalog GUI. So without having to create a .NET form first to put the .NET components in, you can now just use any .NET component directly in a regular Dyalog GUI form. We've stolen an idea from APL Plus and put the user command processor in to make it easier to share development tools. Our new TCP application, not framework, tool for building TCP applications now supports IPv6. How many people here are thinking of moving to IPv6 shortly? Okay, so we're slightly ahead of the curve here. We thought this was, going to be everywhere, but people seem to be dragging their feet significantly. This is something that I don't know if you may not know what it is. The standard IP addresses have four numbers, consist of four numbers between 0 and 255, and they're about to run out. So the TCP IP, the internet needs to change its addressing standard, and the new standard is something called IPv6. So you are going to need to do something about this soon. We added journaling component files in the previous release in 12.0, which would protect the file system against APL crashing. So if APL crashed or was shut down by a system operator, there would be no damage to component files. In 12.1, we've extended that so that even if the operating system crashes and there's uncommitted data in caches, your component files should survive an event like that, if you enable journaling, which does slow component files down very slightly. We've managed to start adding a significant number of APL-coded tools for developers. So SOARS is a web service framework. Mild Server is a simple tool for building web servers. Services are things that you make function calls for over the internet. A web server is one that you would go to with a web browser. Load data is just a workspace of utilities to make it very easy for new users to load data from Excel, HTML, XML, ODBC, something that actually came out of the book project. We thought it would be useful for anybody who starts learning APL with a book is going to want to immediately get hold of data from somewhere. We want to make that very easy. And grapl is actually not a new product. It's the Causeway interactive editor for graphics that we added to the session in the previous release. We're going to embed the graphical editor for that. Hopefully we'll manage to get that into 12.1 before it goes out. That's not quite guaranteed. We've made it possible to deploy your applications as a single executable file, so you can wrap your workspace up with the interpreter, have a single file that's just a standard exe you click on and it runs. This is the stuff that Andy's presentation was going to cover. We've really improved the way that we handle especially Unix sessions via a terminal, taking advantage of the Unicode features, new UTF-8 data streams and Unicode fonts and so on. And we've added a little backdoor to allow us to experiment. Some of you may be familiar with iBeam from older APL systems. We've added it as a system operator rather than as a function, but essentially it serves the same purpose. And this is the kind of stuff you need to come to the Speakeasy bar to find out what all the funny numbers are that allow you to do things that are not in the manuals. So a very large part of the work that went into version 12.1 was just improving the basic performance of the interpreter on a single core. A lot of this work was done by Roger Huey and by our own Nick, by John Scholes and Jeff Streeter. So these are perhaps some of the most spectacular examples. The ones at the top there, we're doing reductions on the first one, 1,000 by 1,000 Boolean matrix. Doing a plus reduction on the first dimension is 7-8 times faster. Not equal scan on big Boolean vectors, up to 60 times faster. Of course, whether this is going to benefit your application is hard to tell, but we do have a number of customers who've just fired their application up on 12.1 and reported that it runs 20-25% faster. Other people will not experience any speed up at all. One which we know a lot of people were worried about is this one in red here, which is not actually so much a speed up as a very significant reduction in the amount of memory that we use when we index Boolean arrays. So you can now work with very much larger Boolean arrays and reorder them. Here's another page of stuff. Sorting, Roger has done a fantastic job on upgrade. It's very, very much faster. And then at the very low level, some of the basic arithmetic has been speeded up quite significantly. So we've optimized, Dyalog APL, unlike I think most other APLs, has both 1 byte and 2 byte integer data types. And we can use SSE instructions that were put into the chips to do gaming, where you can add 4 single byte values in a single operation. And that gives some pretty significant speed-ups. This slide, I guess, proves that I'm not really a PowerPoint guru. That was supposed to appear at the end. So one thing that we put into the core interpreter is, as a small start on multi-core support, is that most of the scalar dyadic functions, if you pass them sufficiently large floating point arguments, they will use multiple cores internally to do a large multiplication of 2 matrices, for example. What we found out was that 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 may not buy you very much. For example, on a modern CPU, if you do that for addition, you have the problem that the CPU can add numbers up much faster than the memory can deliver numbers to the chip. So if you don't have all the data in the cache, and if it's a very large array, of course, you're unlikely to have all the values in the cache, then you can see that this number here, 12%, actually tells you that the speed of the memory management subsystem that all of the CPUs share is only slightly faster than the speed of a single core. So throwing more cores at something like addition doesn't give you anything at all. But if you do something heavy like division or GCD computation, then you can see it scales very nicely. You get twice the speed or 4 times the speed. So how much this will impact your applications is really hard to tell. Some people will feel a significant benefit, but I suspect probably it doesn't give you a huge amount in most applications. Now, something which is going to require a little bit more work on your part is the parallel each operator that we've put in. At the moment, that's a user-defined operator written in APL. And it uses the Conga TCP tool to orchestrate multiple cores working together. And if I'm lucky, now I will be able to show you that. Okay, so this is an example of a user command. Can you read that? Do I need to increase the font a bit? So this user command is the little tool that we have for scripting presentations, so I don't make typing errors. Yep. That enough? Okay, so I'm very grateful to my son Christopher, who's studying to be a math teacher for this little algorithm that I'm going to try and parallelize. He came back last week from a session where they'd been talking about how to teach kids about prime numbers, and they'd been looking at co-prime numbers. 2 numbers are co-prime if they share no factors. So in other words, if the greatest common divisor is 1, so for 10, the co-primes are 1, 3, 7, and 9. And he came back and he was all excited. He said, I'm going to spend a day. I promised the other guys at Teacher Training College I'm going to spend a day writing in APL, because he'd had the 3-day introductory course, a function to find the number of numbers less than n which are co-prime. And I said, you're going to have trouble spending a whole day on that, because here's that computation for the first 25, the numbers up to 25. So that's the count of the number of co-primes less than each number up to 25. And as you can see, that's a nice little defun. I'm using it with each, so we should be able to parallelize that. You get some very nice patterns when you look at this. So here's the co-prime, the number of the co-prime count for the numbers up to 100. And if we do a scatter plot of that, it gives you these fascinating little patterns. You can see the primes going up on the straight line there. Those are the numbers where every number less than them is co-prime. And then you have funny little patterns in there that you can gaze at for hours. But we want to compute lots of them. So here's another little user command I threw together for the application tuning workshop I'm doing on Wednesday. This will be available for everybody. So does anybody have a good joke that takes about 17 seconds? 17. Oh, the machine's feeling well at the moment. Okay, so that was just using each. Now, if I call peach init, if I just give it quote, quote, it just counts the processes in the machine, fires up 2 slave processes, and they put up a little windows just so you can see that they're there. And then if we replace each by Yeah, I'm not sure I've picked the right name for this operator. It's in a namespace called PE for parallel each, and then the name of the operator had to be ACH, which is not beautiful. But as you can see, it took a bit over half the time. That varies a lot depending on what else is happening on the machine. But the CPU time recorded in the session that was actually doing the work, you can see, is almost 0. It just had elapsed time, and it was the 2 other guys who were doing the work. Now, one thing, you do run into the same problem here, that if you have an algorithm which has a very high ratio of memory consumption compared to the amount of work that you're doing, your computer isn't going to deliver memory fast enough to the chip, although you're in a better position if you're parallelizing big chunks of work. And what you need to do then, of course, is you need several computers to participate in this. So this is the really exciting bit of the demo for me. I have my laptop, my other laptop on the desk next to me here. And this is a remote, you can see here, a remote desktop session on it. Now, where's Task Manager? So here's Task Manager on my own, on the laptop that's doing the presentation. Here's Task Manager on my other laptop. If I do this parallel each that I've just done, the local one, you see my own computer goes to 100%. Oops. Yeah, I have no idea what happened there. Sometimes you get these funny glitches under Windows. If I now tell Peach that I have a remote server, give it the name of some other list of machines and the ports that the Peach relay server is listening on, and name a shared folder that's used, when I just fork, the system does a quad save of the active workspace and all the slaves load it up. So I need a shared folder that they can all see. If I now initialize it, you'll see I'll get 2 popping up on my own machine, and then in the remote machine it also pops 2 up. And now when I run this, now using all 4, I fill up all the fish tanks, and it does actually, this example will come down to running roughly 4 times faster than on a single core. And that's something I've had the opportunity over the last few months to demonstrate or to work with a couple of customers on, and we've been able to receive pretty good speed ups on that. Here's one of the benefits of object orientation. When I clear the workspace, you see all the tasks died because they were objects, and destructors fire, which makes sure that they all get shut down nicely. Okay, so parallel each on a single machine works well if you have this good ratio between CPU consumption and memory, and the distributed each is going to work well on any task where you're not passing 2 big arguments and results backwards and forwards, because then the transfer time for the data may make it not work that well. So I visited a customer in Brussels who were doing actuarial calculations. They had a big portfolio where they had to do the same calculation for every person in this portfolio. Version 12.1 very nicely gave a 20% speed up straight out of the box, mostly due to plus dot times being optimized, I think. We found another 20% by monitoring the code and doing a bit of hotspot analysis, and then they had bought an 8-core machine, which wasn't a hyper-threading thing. It was actually 2 quad computers, and that managed then to give an additional 5 times speed up. So at the end of all of this, the software was running about 8 times faster, and they were pretty pleased with that. And they can now buy another 8-core machine, and it'll run 16 times faster, because this parallelizes perfectly. So that's the parallel stuff. Does anybody have any questions about that before we move on to other stuff? Otherwise, come to the workshop on Wednesday afternoon, and we'll look at that in more depth. No? Okay. So the user command processor, this is a very simple idea that APL Plus has had for decades, I guess. And The idea is that you can make programming tools that you use or a bunch of people use available in any workspace without having to copy it into the workspace. Our implementation is a bit different in that a user command is just a single Unicode text file, and all you have to do to share it with your colleague is send them that text file. They drop it into a folder. They don't have to restart APL, and it's just immediately available. So you can use the display function. I'm using a teletype here, obviously, from any workspace without having to copy it in first. A very simple but very powerful idea, I think. The editor has been completely rewritten so that it better supports editing large classes and functions. John Daintree is going to do a presentation on that right after lunch. So I'm not going to go into that at all, other than to say it's really a dramatic facelift that a lot of people have been very complimentary about. It does things that you'll find in other editors, like outlining. You have collapsible regions. There's even some simple refactoring support. I don't know how many people here. I know Dave Thomas, I guess, invented refactoring. Oh, it's an important feature of Eclipse. But how many people here feel they know what refactoring is? The object-oriented guys. Yeah. So I mean, it's just taking a piece of code and. For example, if you have some lines in a function, you want to turn them into a sub-function, there's something which will allow you to select these lines of code, and then it'll suggest what the function header should be, what the local variables should be, and so on, to make it much easier to change the way your code is organized without changing the way that it works, which I guess is the key idea of refactoring. But JD will be showing you some of that stuff after lunch. We finally decided that we talked to enough people who were using XML that we understood what an XML tool for APL programmers should do. Of course, with the .NET interface and other interfaces, it's possible to use, say, probably a whole bunch of XML parsers that are available in the .NET framework. But those tools don't really return data in a form which is very convenient for an array-oriented programmer to use. So there we think that the right representation of XML in APL is a 5-column matrix where you've got a column that tells you for each nested element in your XML, what's the level of nesting, the element name, what's the data, and what are the attributes. So just to give you a very brief idea of what that looks like. Richard Smith will be talking much more about this later today. So here's, okay, I'm using .NET here. Again, I've said this many times before. If you haven't started looking at the .NET framework, if you have it available, I mean, if you're building an application which is going to run on Windows anyway, it is the world's largest utility library. And even if you're not going to use it in any massive way, functions like this system IO file read all text, where you just give it the name of a file and it reads it in, mean that you don't have to continue to carry your own baggage around. All your utility functions for opening native files and reading them and translating them from different code pages and what have you. All that stuff is just in there. It's worth having a look at it. So this one-liner here uses the .NET framework to read the contents of a file. If we have a look at that, it's some XML, and not surprisingly. And we suggest that the way you might want to look at that in APL, so you just pass that, it's a self-inverse function, you pass it some XML, it gives you this 5-column matrix. You pass it a 5-column matrix, it turns it into XML. So this has given us an 85 by 5 matrix. There were 85 data elements in that XML. And if we look at the first 5, you can see the level of nesting increasing, the names of the elements, the data. In the third column, if there were any attributes, you have them as a 2-column matrix of attribute names and values. And then there's a flag column here which tells you things like whether this element has any children, what type of element is this. But Richard will cover that thoroughly a bit later. In fact, I think that's... Yeah, there's probably not much. Does anybody have any questions about Quad XML? Oh. It is very arguable, and we did talk to a bunch of people. There are people, I know in APL Plus there's a guy called Davin Church, who some of you may know, who's built an APL XML library which uses a nested, everything is a deeply nested structure. And I talked to him at some length about that. And then oh, yeah, but that depends on what you're trying to do. I mean, what I think you'll see very many APL applications do is they'll and I think Richard will show this, is that they'll read in the representation of a Word document. They'll search on the names of the tags. They'll do a little bit of logic on that. They'll find the elements of the Word document they want to change. They'll insert new values into these fields, and then they'll just write it back as an XML document. And that's sort of the kind of usage that we've been looking at with this design, to make that really, really easy. The size? No, the question is the size of...
Size of this matrix compared to size of the XML.
That's... Okay, so we've got quad size of XML. The question was what happens to the size of the data when it comes in from XML into this array, and we can see here it was roughly 4,000 characters, and it's turned into something which is about 3 times bigger. I think if you turned it... Yes, but if you turned it into nested objects, I think it might be significantly larger. So I don't think this is a bad trade-off. But I mean, it's a tool for a certain way of looking at XML. The XML parser in .NET is available and very easy to use from APL. You know, system.whatever.xml. Then you've got validating parsers and all that kind of stuff. We decided not to do any of that XML validation, querying, and so on in APL. There are lots of tools to do that are very sophisticated and massive amounts of work. The philosophy of this tool is that once you've filtered your XML down to the part that APL really needs to do something about, you have a very fast way of turning it into something you can deal with and back again. That's really the target of this new tool. And that's why we decided that, you know, although there are tools in .NET to do this, instead of just recommending to people that they always use those tools, we're providing a tool here because there's nothing in .NET that easily turns XML into a comfortable array data structure for manipulation by... I think most people here would be pretty comfortable with dealing with that array and understanding what it means. Okay. My 4 time. Okay. Yeah, so this I'm going to show you the integration of .NET GUI components. There are, again, .NET is becoming, I think, the world's largest utility library, and that's not just functions for reading text. That's things like, you have whole companies like these DevExpress people who make grid and data editors, ribbon, toolbar menus, OLAP data mining controls, calendars, data gauges, editors, you know, you name it. Thousands of fantastically good-looking tools. And those are now all directly available. Now you have to pay these guys. I just downloaded the free samples. I'm sure they won't mind me showing them to you. And it's really easy to use. Here, so I'm going to trace this function. I hope you can see all that. So there's this ugly string you need to set up to say where on the system you've downloaded and installed their tools. And that's about the hardest bit, is typing that correctly. So I sort of looked at the palette of stuff that they had. They had something called Calc Edit, Color Edit, Font Edit, Memo Edit, Date Edit, and Time Edit. And I thought I'd like to see what those are. So I create a little form. Uh-oh. How did that happen? Yeah, that's what happens when resolution changes on you. So let's make that. Okay, now we can see it. Okay, so I made a form that I'm pretty sure is big enough. And then for each one of those 6 names that I got, I get its name out. I create a label which says this is the Calc Edit. And then I make a net control and the name of the control and a position that I'm gradually increasing so that I'll scatter these things down the... Okay, so there's the Calc Edit. There's the Color Edit. Font Edit. Memo Edit. If it's a memo edit, I put some text in it and set it to a reasonable size and adjust my position pointer a little bit. Put the Date Edit in. Set up some callbacks, and I'm done. So I mean, you basically use them the same way as any of the controls that we supply, but they just have massive amounts of properties and beautiful things you can do with them. Calc Edit is a pocket calculator. Yeah, and all the properties are just things that you can dot into. Color Edit is one of these things. Okay, it fired a callback, which I haven't written, and you get information about. I mean, so you're getting all these .NET callbacks, and you can easily deal with them, look at the properties of the callback, do whatever you need to. I'm not going to do anything. Font Edit, pick a font. Date Edit. Well, you get the idea. So this, I think, is something that really, without actually being a .NET product, you can now really hook into all of the beautiful stuff out there. Okay, so to recap, well, no, I've probably spent enough time on this. Is anything here? I haven't gone into much detail here. Is anybody who'd like to ask a question about any of the stuff that I haven't gone into yet? No. Okay. So we thought this was going to be out before the conference. We were convinced that it would. That's coming. I still have half an hour. There's no real support for cloud computing in version 12.1, though of course it has various web components that you could use. Yeah. What about cloud computing? And the answer is, well, I'll talk briefly about that, and then Dave Thomas will actually help some of us understand what it is a bit later. So we need to finish the packaging and get the last bugs out of the editor, which is this is the only component that's been completely rewritten. So that's where there are still a few problems remaining. It should be out a couple of weeks, 3 weeks maybe after the conference, so we have time to concentrate on it. It'll be out on Windows and AIX first, and Linux and PDA are also pretty much done, but the packaging work there will take a bit longer. It's not too late if you want to join the beta test program for the last couple of weeks. Just send me an email and sign up to receive our tweet. I'm not sure how good an idea that was. I tweeted a couple of times and I haven't tweeted much since. But I promise you that when the product goes out, I will send at least one tweet. And we will also celebrate the release of the product when it goes out by putting our forum, which we've been playing with internally now for about a year, into production. We just need to get the product out first. So this will replace the Dyalog users group on Google. Though I guess for a period of time we may continue to copy messages across to there. We think this is going to, again, it's something that really will make it attractive to young people who are getting involved with APL. It'll be easier for them to ask for help, I think, when we have something like this. They'll feel comfortable with it. We've put a lot of effort into solving the APL keyboard and fonting problems on this forum. That's one of the reasons why it's taken such a long time to get it out there. So we believe that from any of the major browsers, you're going to be able to view and type APL characters into this forum. And the email digests that it sends out, you will also be able to read the APL characters that are in there, Microsoft willing. The email clients are still doing a pretty poor job. Many of them are of rendering Unicode text, but it's rapidly improving. So we hope that problem will finally stop being something people talk about. Okay, so what are we going to do for the next release cycle? Well, there's going to be something called Conga 2.1 and the version 13. Conga 2.1 is really a small release, but we've been working with a customer who needed much more sophisticated support for certificates, including smart cards for doctors and nurses logging in at a hospital. So we've added support for the Windows Certificate Store, which is the component that handles these cards, and for encrypted certificates, which is something we should have done. But we needed Peter Michael Hager. I don't know if you know him, but he's an APL programmer and he's also a cryptography guru. And we've been very fortunate to be able to get him involved in this project. We've learned an incredible amount, and we're now in a position to start really providing some security and encryption functionality. So this should be ready quite soon. Version 13, we're going to continue to work on performance and QA, and hopefully Andy will be there next year to tell you more about the regime that we have to submit to. More focus on multi-core cache optimization. The 64-bit version is starting to get important. Those of you who try to use it may or may not be aware that there's actually a 2 billion element restriction on the size of any array. So far that's only been a theoretical limitation, or at worst a limitation on Boolean arrays, but we're now starting to get machines with so much memory that it's becoming a real problem. So we hope that we'll be able to remove that. And we haven't finished 12.1, so this feature list is not settled yet. But these are the things that we're thinking about. We will be adding a couple of data types, we think. The complex numbers are definite. The 128-bit decimal floating point is still something we're investigating, but we think that it is something that's important. There are people doing banking calculations out there with large currency amounts where the 64-bit IEEE floating point representation is simply not accurate enough. Yes?
Since you're going the route of adding complex numbers, I think it's a great idea. Have you considered going full tilt and actually implementing quaternions as well as complex numbers?
We thought about it for a couple of seconds, yeah. I don't know. Is there a call for that? I mean,
I think you would have something that would completely set you apart from everybody else in the field.
yeah.
Very important.
Are there no programming platforms that have quaternions? MATLAB and those guys haven't?
Well, I'm not familiar with any that have
Yeah.
support for them, but definitely.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know, we talked about it briefly. We had this idea, well, out of the people in this room, there'll be 2 who can comfortably use complex numbers. And out of those two, 1% of them will need quaternions. Yeah.
What are quaternions?
I think they're just like, it's two complex numbers. It's a four-dimensional, and then there's octernions and hepta-something ternions, I guess. Yeah.
I'll be talking about complex numbers in this room after dinner tonight, and that's a good question to ask at the seminar.
Okay. Yeah, so these two data types are really going in really aimed at very different parts of the user community. The complex numbers are really there to attract the engineers, educational users, and the 128-bit decimals are there for the bankers. On platforms like Windows, where there's no hardware support for these, they will run. I mean, you're looking at a slowdown of something like 30 or 40 times on your floating point operations. But then we've had large customers look at their computations and calculate the amount of time the application actually spends doing floating point calculations. And they find that Intel's claim that very little time gets spent on those is true. But IBM, of course, has hardware support for these. At the moment, we're only really aiming at the Intel platform for these, because that's where that's where the customer who's asked for it is, basically. But of course, it's possible to do a power implementation as well. We think the next types for us that we're thinking of are probably rational numbers and unlimited precision integers. When you talk to Peter Michael Hager about encryption and so on, he says, oh, you've got to have these things to do big prime number calculations and so on. One good thing, well, from our point of view anyways, we think we've decided we don't need 64-bit integers. We thought we needed 64-bit integers to represent 64-bit pointers, but we can now hide those in 128-bit decimal floating point data type, we think. Or maybe complex numbers. There's also a suggestion to represent 64-bit pointer as a complex number. 64-bit integers are very problematic for an APL implementation because they break the... there's a very nice progression of precision, 1-byte integer, 2-byte, 4-byte, floating point with 53 bits of precision. If you put, which means you have this nice rule, you can blow up from a 4-bit integer to a floating point number. If you put in 64-bit integers, you end up with integers that have more precision than your floating point representation. And then what to do about quad CT and stuff like that gets... Yeah. Yeah, you just use a big number. The question is, how can we index an array with 2 billion elements if we don't have 64-bit integers? And well, you could certainly do it with 128-bit decimal. But anyway, we've been dodging 64-bit integer for some time, and at the moment we're sort of heaving a sigh of relief that we may be able to do without them forever. We may be proven wrong, but that's our current thinking anyway. If anybody can prove us wrong, I'd like to know immediately. I know MicroAPL has put 64-bit integers in, and they seem to have gotten away with it without too much voodoo. So it is possible, clearly. We think there are a whole bunch of improvements we'd like to make to tools like the way we handle error messages in APL is very, very brief. You make an error, it says index error, domain error. You get very little information about what happened. When you get a file access error, it would be nice to know what component of the operating system actually issued which error message about why you couldn't access that file. So Quad DMX is something we hope to put in version 13. We're certainly going to have a go at designing it to start adding that kind of information that you can now get from the underlying components. Certainly, a lot of the stuff that goes into the status window would appear here, yes. So the status window probably still has a role to play, but Quad DMX will take over a fair amount of what the status window is doing today. There's more and more focus on performance, and the tool that we currently have, Quad Monitor, has a number of restrictions. It's not very high precision. It doesn't deal well with recursion, and we think it may be time to rewrite it to make it a tool that's much easier to use. MicroAPL did a demo at BAPLA 09 conference of it. You select a menu item, say monitoring on, you run your application, you switch it off, and then it produces graphs and stuff instead of the kind of tool that we currently have. It would be nice to be able to provide something like that. And then we have a bit of work to do still on our introduction of pointers in the language. There are still tools for looking at the stack which don't give you references to the namespaces involved. Quad NC, Quad NL need a makeover. One thing that I'd emphasize repeatedly, and I don't feel I can do sufficiently often, is I think people should really be looking at putting source code into Unicode text files. And one thing I'd like to see in version 13 is that the editor, the language will start supporting these directly. So you'll be able to load source code in Unicode text files directly into the language without using this SALT tool that we have, which is currently written in APL. You should be able to edit text files directly from the APL interpreter and have the benefit of syntax coloring and so on while editing the file directly. We're looking seriously at providing a general purpose encryption library to allow you to do all the kinds of things that you need. If you want to get on the cloud or the web in any way, you have to start handling certificates, passwords securely. And it would be nice to provide a cross-platform library for that. But we're going to say, well, what can we do in 12 months? Some of this may get in, some of it may be postponed for a future release. We have a couple of other interesting projects that are going on. We're together with some customers. We're looking at something like this project, which I'll be doing a demo of tomorrow morning. A tool which allows any APL application to present itself to the outside world as a relational database. So Microsoft Access or Crystal Reports wouldn't be able to tell that your APL application wasn't just a SQL database. There are a lot of APL applications that really contain data which it's very relevant to expose in this way. For example, a view on a portfolio of bonds. You can just export that data into Oracle, and then somebody can try and report on it with Crystal Reports, but they will then not be able to do the computations that they need, because Crystal Reports is a pretty weak tool for doing computations. On the other hand, if you can expose a real-time computed view of a portfolio, then you can use really excellent presentation tools on this live data that APL is serving up. So this is something that I'm certainly very excited about. I think this is cool. We won't be able to bundle that free of charge with the product because we're using a third-party middleware product. So what the licensing of that's going to be is currently unknown. Yes, but what the pricing to, for a single user license? Yeah. Yes. Oh yeah. Yeah. Yes. If we do this, it'll be OEM'd, and if it breaks, you come to us, and we'll be responsible for every component in the chain. Our Windows development environment is currently very much richer than what we provide on Unix's, Linux, and so on. And we're looking at the idea of putting together a remote development environment that would have many of the nice features of the Windows IDE, but could be used to develop or manage a remote Unix session. And also something that you would use for debugging a Windows service that had crashed on a machine which was not allowed to display a desktop locked away in a machine room somewhere. You could connect this thing to it and debug a service that had crashed. We're still unsure about the significance of Mono in the market. I mean, Mono is an open source version of .NET. And it would be beautiful for us if that became significant and available on all platforms, because then we could just write our IDE, for example, for .NET, and it would work on all these other platforms on it. We could make a Macintosh version, etc., with a minimum of effort. We're also thinking about building a bridge to Mono so that applications could take advantage of that. But this now we're really getting into speculative stuff. Don't expect to see that unless somebody comes to us and says we must have it. We'll talk about it. And we really want to work together with people like Kai Jäger, putting up the APL library, to make more and more of the tools that you currently get as APL workspaces with our distribution converted into the scripted text files up in an open source fashion where everybody can participate in developing some modular tools. Right. Maybe I should just skip the next few slides. We have now actually started a research project to produce a completely new, fully managed APL interpreter. So we've gone beyond merely talking about it. Our intention, if we can get this to work, is that once we're happy with it and we've talked to a couple of our major customers, we're going to publish this. We're going to make the information public and invite other APL vendors, people in the community to comment on it and participate, at least tell us what they think is wrong with it, and then we'll decide whether we're going to do anything about that or not. The goal of this project is to produce something which is fully integrated with Microsoft.NET, but the core language syntax, everything we consider in that syntax, there must be nothing there which would only make sense in a .NET environment. So although you'll be able to refer to .NET data types and use them, they will not be primitive elements of this language. We should be able to implement this language on other platforms, because Microsoft.NET is a wave, but APL will still be here 50 years from now. So we have to be careful about this stuff. So the point of having this, why would you need an APL interpreter? Another APL interpreter, the one we have is nice. We know how it works. There are situations where you can't deploy solutions using what they call unmanaged code. If you want to deliver code in a secure fashion over the internet or various other scenarios, people are going to be insisting that you deliver what they call a fully managed code solution, which basically means you're writing to a virtual machine that Microsoft provide, or in the case of Mono, that an open source community provide, which is able to police that your application is only doing the things that it's allowed to do. So you can say this application may not write to the hard disk, and then whatever the application tries to do, it simply won't be able to do it. That, I think, in a nutshell, is the may people debug this? Can they attach a debugger to this application if it fails? You can control that, and you can be absolutely sure that a hacker is not going to be able to get into this code unless they've broken something very, very fundamental in Microsoft's virtual machine, which I guess is theoretical. Are there any, do you know, Dave, whether there have been any instances of that? People hacking through the managed layer? Oh, you can't. Okay, you can't answer that. Okay. Okay. So, for example, you'd be able to write a web application which, when it runs inside the browser. It can provide a rich GUI, a rich client experience on the browser. You can sort of do that in Dyalog APL now, but it's going to pop up and say, do you trust Dyalog? And your system administrator said you're not allowed to click OK to that. I mean, technically, it's perfectly feasible to do these things today, but it's getting harder and harder as system administrators get more and more paranoid. So the design of this is still very much under discussion. But, I mean, of course, the full set of APL primitives, operators, the important language features. It's designed as a tool for APL thinkers, but comfortable for software engineers, and definitely not the other way around.
That's very important.
It would be...
If you don't do that, F# leads termination line.
Yeah, there are already people who do that. We have to, I mean, we want to integrate smoothly with all these platforms, but we have to stick to what we know is the unique selling proposition of our technology. If we allow that to be watered down, we don't have a reason to be here any longer. But I think we do. There's one big language difference, which is going to mean that your applications will not just load and run, and that is that on the .NET framework, which is object-oriented to the core, you can't really have semi-global variables, which are the infrastructure of many APL applications, unfortunately. So this business of just being able to see the local variables of your calling environment without further ado is going to be gone. But, I mean, a lot of people don't have applications like that. They've taken great care to write maintainable applications. Some companies you get shot for using these. But we also believe that the equivalent of namespaces, which will also be in this language, will provide a reasonable migration path. You're going to have to do some work to rewrite your application. It might be non-trivial, but you will be able to do it. You're ahead of me by about 5 seconds. So, what this system will not have is all these old quad things for managing 24x80 character mode screens and shared variables and sending data on a serial port and so on. That stuff will be gone, because if you need to do those things, there are perfectly good equivalents in the .NET framework. Tools that are comfortable to use for an APL programmer, because when you're doing these things, you don't need APL thinking. We might lose some things that we actually really appreciate very much, which is the ability, I mean, we have one customer who says the single most important feature of your product is that when a production batch job crashes at 3 o'clock in the morning, it saves the workspace with the stack. I get a call at home at 3:30 a.m. I can log in, I can load the workspace, I can hand-hold it past that bit of code where some partner of ours sent us data. They changed the data format that they give us without notice. I can hand-hold it past that. I can reconnect to the database, and I can resume execution. And if I couldn't do that, we wouldn't be able to operate. Now, people say, well, you should design software not to require that kind of functionality and so on, and your partners shouldn't change the data format without telling you. But this is really hard to do in the .NET framework, because you may have an execution stack which has code written in C# and loaded from other people's funny libraries. So you may have an SI stack which is only partly APL. And you may have stuff there which is what they would call non-serializable. So you can't actually save it and resume it. You can't return it to a meaningful state after loading the workspace. But I do think the ability to save workspaces without a stack is something that we do want to have. I think the idea that you can save your functions and your data together in a unit. I mean, try telling an Excel user that that's not important. He should just load his macros from somewhere, and no. There are people who need that stuff. Okay, so Kai, the jury is still out on that. Quad CT we have to have, I believe. Quad CT is the thing that makes it possible to think of APL. I mean, to me, the thing that makes it possible to think of numbers just as numbers without really worrying about the data type. Quad I/O is a tricky one. You've got the community. I think you can say there's the software engineering types out here and the math geeks out there. They are both happy with Quad I/O 0. And then in the middle, you've got 80% of the population who really feel more comfortable. You know, what's the first element of an array? Well, it's number 1, right? So if you had to pick one, it would be 0. But I think we're going to have to, personally, I think we're going to have to keep index origin. Well, yeah. Oh, yes.
Is this a server side or a client side technology? I'm
Yes.
trying to grasp.
No, it's well, you'll be able to use it exactly like any other APL system. But the main reason for having it is probably to build, at least initially. Initially, the real reason why you'd want to move away from what you're doing now to play with a completely new technology would be that you want to do something over the internet where you have these security requirements. But at the end of the day, this is going to be a completely ordinary APL, just like the one we have today. But of course, it's going to take, before it has all of the tools that we have built over the last 25 years, we're not going to be able to do that in a year or two. So initially, we'll be focusing on supporting, I guess, what you might call server or internet applications.
It's not a concept like having a Java virtual machine on a client and some APL code downloads in a web page and run. That's not what you're talking about.
You will be able to run it in that fashion, and in fact, I'll show you that in a second. So just to finish this slide, we will have some of things like Quad XML. I argued for why we want to have that. Component files, I think, are important. There are some things where you've designed some tools to really work well for APL programmers. Those things we have to keep, even though one of the goals of the language is to make use of what's on the .NET framework. So it's not a question of a new product that you're going to need to migrate to. It's a complementary product which allows the use of APL, initially at least. The reason for having it is it allows the use of APL in places where you simply can't deploy it today. It would also be very useful to those of our customers who need managed code for other reasons, use Visual Studio a lot, or are just, want to have stuff on the Microsoft. They've got an overall policy of trying to build everything as tightly integrated Microsoft.NET components. The rate of development of the core product is going to accelerate. We're not going to be taking resources off the existing product, reducing that in order to do this, but we are now in a position where we can do both. And we're going to be taking care that the interop is going to be fairly straightforward between these. Of course, since this thing will produce .NET assemblies, you can already call them. If it existed, you could already call them from the current product. We do want to be able to share component files and transmit binary APL arrays via TCP/IP, but probably not saved workspaces. And we probably will also, there will be some new language features in this new product which we will port back into the old product in order to allow you to write code which will run on both platforms if you adhere to certain coding rules. Alex. I think those will not be exchangeable. But I mean, both products should have serialization tools that eventually. Yeah?
Can I ask you a quick question? Number one, I think this is a fantastic idea. The question that I have is, are you planning on using the APL characters?
Yes.
APL count?
Sorry, APL sharp. Sorry, I didn't say that. APL sharp, like F sharp, C sharp, and all that stuff. Yeah. Yes. Absolutely.
Can I make a suggestion that you have an option to use an ASCII character set? And I love the APL characters. I mean, don't get me wrong. And I know that people have tried this.
Yeah.
But nobody's come anywhere close to getting it right, in my opinion. It can be done very, very elegantly
Yeah.
using pure ASCII. And I think that if you do use pure ASCII, and again, I love the APL character set myself.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong. But the rest of the world just isn't ready.
Yeah. I mean,
If you really want to make this a big success,
One-
I think you have the opportunity to
Yeah.
do so. You seriously consider
Yeah.
the concept of using
I mean,
digraphs and trigraphs
yeah.
to replace, the special characters.
Yeah.
If you want a sticky succession,
I hear you, yeah. I don't think there's any evidence from the last 40 years that any one of those schemes has done anything to increase the palatability of APL. I mean, as you say, VAX APL or whatever had this native. There have been APL systems which have had, you could say they didn't do it right. Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, we'll speak easy session. Okay, so here it is. This is just to prove that it's not pure vaporware. At the moment, Kai will be very pleased with the result of that. No, it doesn't do that yet. Plus reduce iota 0 is 4950. Control Shift plus. Aha. See the benefit. Whoa. So far so good. It's just like APL, except obviously index origin is... but then there will be things that are different. What's this going to give? 5 zeros. Because the thing on the left is a string, which is a scalar. It's an atomic string. So we're comparing one string on the left with 5 characters on the right, and they don't match. But of course, this is one of the features that, again, if we decide to do this in APL sharp, this particular one I think we might well do in Dyalog as well. So that we've discussed this in the past. Haven't seen a good enough reason to do it yet, but having APL sharp might be. At this prototype, which couldn't actually do much more than what I showed you, only has origin 0. It doesn't have quad IO. But I think I'm supporting quad IO at the moment. We'll see how far I get with that. So we're going to start reviewing this design externally this winter. I hope we'll be able to present a bunch of papers on it at APL 2010. Which is going to be a combined APL community and Dyalog conference in Berlin. The earliest I can imagine any form of general availability would be a couple of years from now. And I think even if customers came to us and said, here's $1 million, we want, prioritize this, that might make us more ambitious with the features, but it's not going to bring the release date forward. I don't think that's really possible. Yeah. Sorry, well, that was what I clicked on to bring up the, it's gone now. Yeah, what we saw there was actually APL Sharp version negative something running inside Internet Explorer with presenting a full development environment inside IE. Sorry, I didn't explain that at all. It also runs in Firefox. Yeah. Okay, I am now already over. I don't really know much about cloud computing. It sounds like a good home for vaporware. And Dave will teach us all about this, and I expect, we'll see in a moment. This is about what I know about clouds. But actually, to be serious, we have started a real investigation into whether it makes sense for us to try and provide some tools now, whether the time has come. At the moment, we have a consultant helping us look at this, a guy who has experience with building web applications. We're looking at initially at what the Amazon Web Service. They've been doing this in 2006, so I guess they're a mature provider now. Basically, the idea here is you provide a virtual machine image, and they scale it. So if you have 10,000 users, they'll run however many copies of this virtual machine, and they'll do load balancing and stuff. And we need to provide some tools for you to write applications that will fit easily into that. And they have all these nice acronyms: Elastic Compute Cloud and Simple Storage Service, that we'll try and find ways to plug into. So the idea is we'll provide you with recipes or pre-configured Amazon machine images that you can load up, configure a bit, and then deliver it to Amazon. How you're going to pay for this and so on. What you pay to Amazon, what you pay to us is going to be interesting, of course. But again, we hope we can wrap this up in a way that's, anybody who can write an APL function is going to be able to build a cloud app after spending a couple of days reading about it. Okay. So there's the cloud. Actually, I'm going to skip all this stuff. I was going to look back at what we've done in the last few releases, adding object orientation, source code management, and so on. We think we're in a position now where we're really, with the tutorials and the tools that we've put together, we can actually start marketing APL again outside the APL community, which is great. I look forward to that. Yeah, we've been through all of this. Can I spend a couple more minutes, or? Yeah, I'll wrap up quick. So, just a couple of foils with recommendations on what we think you should seriously be looking at with your application. 64-bit now, even on Windows, is becoming a reliable platform that you might want to look at. Only if you need big workspaces, of course. Your code won't run faster here. In fact, if anything, it'll run slightly slower because all your pointers are 64-bit instead of 32-bit. So you're not looking at this for speed. It's just if you need more addressability. But some people do. Unicode, we have the Classic Edition, and we will have it for the foreseeable future. But at some point, it's going to start hurting us to provide certain types of functionality in the Classic interpreter. There's going to be stuff where Unicode is really required. Maybe we need a new symbol for a character. And at some point in, 5 years or whatever, the Classic version will start to become a second-rate citizen. So there's no hurry, but you really should start thinking about what it's going to take to move your application. Hopefully next year, I would really like to see, I know some people are working on Unicode migrations. It would be really great to see some papers next year on the experience, just how hard it was. So far, I think some people have been able to go over pretty smoothly. If you're not using DLLs written in C++ and stuff like that you call outside of APL, you basically just load your workspace and run it. But if you've been careless enough to use any external components, then of course going both to 64-bit and Unicode is much harder. Take a look at Peach. Your customers are going to expect you to use all the cores that they have. And the individual chips are not getting faster. prepare for the web or the cloud. There are several presentations here. That's really great to see. People who've been using ASP.NET are talking about how they built applications. Look at web services. And take a look at putting your source code into those Unicode text files, because it's really going to help you in the future. And I think I can stop now. So there's a whole bunch of talks later today going into details of some of the things that I've shown you briefly. Take note of those. And I'll put that up in a second. We've been keeping busy, I think. We're really starting to enjoy the benefits of being a significantly larger team. So even when we say we're going to take a consolidation year, there's massive stuff going into the interpreter. And we hope that you're going to be able to enjoy some of this stuff. Thank you for listening, even though I went over.